state filter is the minimal unique one to keep track of whether or not these two moving bodies, robots or humans, are in the same room together. So it ends up being quite minimal. It doesn't keep track of their exact states. It doesn't have to. It only needs like the memory of a couple of flip-flops, just a couple of bits to keep track of these. We can also ask a question for a fixed policy. We get some policy that works, plan or policy that works, that maps information states to actions. Can I further reduce the information space, even if I allow surprises? Before I was saying I want to find the unique minimal information space so that I could predict what the sensor is going to output. But let's say I don't even care about that. I could just make a policy that solves the task of getting to position number 2 by just telling the robot to move forward. And then for this particular environment, it's meant to be circular. So position 3 is here, but it's also here. So if I just tell it to move forward, it'll be like going around as if it's on a circular track. And that policy alone, it'll be surprised when it gets to the goal. Let's say the goal is to be at position 2, but it doesn't need any other information. So you can collapse the information space all the way down to just a singleton, and it doesn't really care. So generally speaking, we have lots of different ways to use this general theory. We use it in one way that I talked about, taking these histories and collapsing it down. We can also take a fixed policy and collapse it down. We can take any internal information space and collapse it down. We can also apply it to the external state space itself and try to collapse that down. We can adjust what our godlike description is of the universe or environment that the robot is in. So that's kind of the general idea. So I wanted to just kind of give you the gist of that. I know it's somewhat theoretical, but that might entice you to read some of our recent papers on that, which I gave on the earlier slide. So let me kind of quickly go through some other things, and then I can take some questions. It doesn't look like I'm too far through my talk, but most of the talk was in the beginning. So I just want to quickly go through some things here. So in terms of robot localization and mapping, we can imagine a robot that's in a circular environment here. This is like I just gave. It's a kind of linear circular one in the sense that it's cyclic. When it gets over to position 3, it goes back to position, back here to this other position 3, and it keeps going. And we might want to ask, can a robot distinguish whether it's stuck on a trap like this, going back and forth on a track like this, or can it distinguish that from being able to go on indefinitely forever? So in a continuous setting, it may be that the robot goes around in circles here, or it's actually on some kind of helix, but it can't detect the height dimension. Can it distinguish between these? This is called the loop closure problem in robotics and mapping and such. So one thing that's interesting about that is that if you move forward or backwards and you're not sure whether or not you're in the same place again, this shows the tree of possible ways the environment might look to you based on different executions. If we start the robot at the beginning and give it a different string to execute, there will be this tree of all different possibilities. And then as soon as we allow it to like maybe see the same place twice in terms of sensing output, like maybe when it's over here in position 7 or it's in position -3, it observes yellow. Then it says, okay, it might start to think those are equivalent. Maybe they are in reality, maybe they're not, but that starts to resolve ambiguities whenever it sees position 2 here and it observes green, something different. So you have this robot that goes around and you say, okay, this maybe corresponds to one action, this corresponds to another one. But when we get back to this big yellow room here, is it the same or not? Do we have a sensor that can tell this? This ends up being very closely connected to notions of covering spaces in mathematics, if you've seen this in the area of topology. So I don't know what math background in general that you might have, but there's very interesting and deep connections to topology. These are things called covering spaces. This is from a book by Alan Hatcher on algebraic topology. But these correspond exactly to the different kinds of confusability that a robot could have trying to come back to the same place again after moving. I just wanted to point out there's some nice things. We have some very general results for that. I think this might be a little more off the mathematical deep end, but I just want to mention it a bit here. We have a paper on this, and there's this general idea of if two environments can be covered by another environment, then there end up being bisimulation equivalent. So back to this notion of bisimulation that I talked about. So we have some very nice mathematical topological ways to look at localization. We also did some very minimal kind of mapping a long time ago, which are related to these things. So imagine you have a robot with a very simple sensor that can only detect discontinuities in depth as it sweeps around its sensor. And then I move the robot around by just chasing these discontinuities. So whenever there's a discontinuity in measuring distance, as it sweeps around, it can go towards the discontinuity until something happens with the discontinuity. The discontinuities may either appear or disappear, which happens when you go back and forth like this, or they may split or merge when you go back and forth in cases like this. This is a discontinuity in depth here, and it splits into these two when the robot goes from here up to here, or they merge when it goes in the other direction. So based on that, we developed a complete method for navigating robots optimally, even though the robot can never measure distances. So it just moves around in its environment and it learns some kind of tree structure so that when it's done, it can get back to any place where it's been in the environment before by just chasing these discontinuities, by moving towards them. So it can do distance optimal navigation, but it never actually measures distances. All we show that it's sufficient and minimal to put this tree into the robot's brain. More recently, we've shown minimality of it in 2024, but we had this method about 25 years ago. And we showed that it's this is a minimal sufficient structure for doing distance optimal navigation in a polygonal environment. Oops, I don't want to do that again. And oops, okay, I'm getting stuck. I need to click somewhere else. There we go. We have a little bit of theory of robot illusions. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time. I just want to give a taste of that. It could also be the case that there's an internal information space in the robot. There's a state space that's been assumed by the engineer, let's say, and then there's reality, the truth outside. And we did some work where we developed theories for understanding the differences between these so that there could be cases where the robot plausibly believes that it's in some state. Let me just give a simple picture here. Like, for example, we took a vacuum cleaning robot and my collaborator, Marku here, put some fake wall in for a little while that made the robot declare that it was done vacuuming the floor. So we created perceptual illusions for it. So we can also look at these differences between reality and what the robot models in terms of there's an external state space description or model that it was using as part of its internal reasoning, but that goes wrong, and we can come up with ways to fool robots and things. But that's just a quick taste of that. We also got into extreme minimalism, like what's the very smallest amounts we can get away with, and how dumb can we make the robot and still accomplish tasks. I really like to think about this. This is very useful in applications like MEMS or like microscopic kinds of robots and things where you have much less sensing and actuation and computation that you can put on it. Let me show you my thought-provoking robot. So we made this intelligent robot a while ago. Oops, right here. Let me try to get out of the full screen here. Oh, why can't I get out of that? No. Oh, I got to Control L it. Okay. So let's make this robot here. Let's make this robot video here. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit, I hope. So this is my escape robot. You put it in a complicated environment and it tries to escape. In this environment, there was no escape, but it'll even try to go down to this little hole here in the bottom. It tries every place imaginable. So this is my intelligent escape robot. See, it goes everywhere, trying to find its way out. It's a very active busybody. So what was the strategy for this robot? So it turns out that this robot was just a simple toy. It had no sensing. The actuation was just a motor that just turns at about 2 hertz with a weight on the bottom here so that it's off center. And so it just goes rolling along and smacks into the walls, and that's all it was. So there were no sensors and no computation, nothing like that going on here. So we're kind of fooled by that. Well, then we started looking at problems like mathematical billiards, where you can do very incredible behaviors. Let me just show an example of that. So inside of a simple polygon for almost all billiard bounces, this is a very complicated polygon, but if you just hit like something like, let's say, a billiard ball and let it just keep bouncing around forever, it turns out it'll hit everywhere. It'll hit every open set inside that environment. It's even ergodic, which is some stronger uniformity condition. So it's very impressive. So we wanted mechanical systems that can do stuff like that. You can imagine there's no brain. It just goes bouncing around and covers everything. So for some kind of problems like cleaning the floor or doing some kind of security sweep, you can get away with a lot with very little. We did something like this with 50 robots. Oops, went the wrong way with it. We did it's like 50 robots like this. I'll speed it up as well. But we got them with using little ramps and stuff to move in distributions that we want. We want to get a certain number of balls in certain places, and we were able to get that to happen. So we were very happy with this kind of stuff. And we have some theory that also goes along with this, doing some Markov chain type analysis and what happens in the stable limit. We have kind of a whole theory associated with this, with again, with extreme minimalism. Also down this path of extreme minimalism. Oh, and we also have, oh yeah, I should do this one too, sorry. There's, yeah, also along this path, we have these simple robots that's based on that same simple filter that I talked about, well, whether or not the robots can keep in the same environment. Oh, that one's not going to work, is it? Oh, it's another. Oops. That one's not going to play. Sorry. But anyway, there's two very simple robots there, and we get them to move around clockwise forever, and they also keep in separate rooms. So each one of the robots can only cross these tape lines only when the other robot is in the room before it, so they can move on to the next room, and they just keep going around and around forever in a kind of patrolling pattern. So, and the brains for each robot is just a simple 2-bit filter. So that was kind of the idea for that. Sorry, that one doesn't play. One more thing that's really interesting is what about the case of, can you find one plan that works for every possible planning problem? So we did this very recently, and the idea is to just start with a simple robot like this. It has 4 motions, up, down, left, right. We just looked at problems like this, and you have a goal that you want to get to. So if I want to get to the goal with this one, I go right, right, and then back, and then I would end up there. But what if I want to use the same action to get to this, to go for this problem? Well, right, right, and back wouldn't work. I need another sequence of actions. Can I find a single sequence that works for all problems? Well, no, unless you make a certain assumption. What if I command the robot to go somewhere and it's blocked? Then it just does nothing. So if you make that simple assumption that the robot just skips whatever actions, then I want to know, is there one action that will solve all planning problems, all possible environments here with a finite number of white tiles? And the answer is yes. And it turns out we use something called normal numbers, which are beautiful constructions. They go back to being studied by Borel, who did a lot of foundational mathematics for, let's say, calculus, real numbers, and basis of probability theory over a century ago. And basically, these normal numbers are sequences of numbers so that every sequence of length k appears infinitely often and with equal frequency. It's believed, actually, Borel showed that almost all real numbers are normal numbers if you expand their digits out. But nobody seems to be able to prove that any ordinary ones are, in fact. So it's widely believed that pi, for example, is a normal number, but no one's been able to show it, believe it or not, with all kind of things. So there's but anyway, it doesn't matter. They're widely believed or conjectured to be normal numbers anyway, or we can use some given ones. So for example, if you put pi into base 4, you get some sequence like this. Why don't I just convert that directly into actions for the robot and then tell the robot to execute some sequence? So if we put that in as the robot's brain, it just generates, kind of mindlessly generates these digits of pi or some other sequence that's been proven to be normal. Then it turns out with a very small amount of brain space, we end up with a sequence of actions that will solve all possible planning problems. So it's really crazy. So it solves all grid problems or even more general directed graph problems. We also made a version that works in continuous spaces in n dimensions, which is quite something. And if you run it long enough, it'll converge to optimal plans. It's just that the algorithm or the robot will not know when it's in fact optimal, but it will converge to the optimal one. So it's just kind of a strange caveat that happens there. So this just shows how the robot explores for some different cases for like these grid-like problems or maze problems, and even for some continuous space problems. We made another version for continuous spaces where the step size that the robot takes also varies based on these digits that come from pi or whatever other sequence we want to use. And we established that we can get to these, we can get to a goal region in a finite number of steps deterministically, regardless of the problem. So it solves all possible planning problems. You might not like how long it takes to get there, but it's very interesting as an exploration strategy. They're deterministically guaranteed to get there. Some more stuff, which I think I'll skip over because I want to make sure I have some time for questions. So, but there's a whole like hierarchy of sensors, and this is also very closely related to the things I talked about with regard to this partitions over these different collections of strings we were talking about, these history information states. We talked about when they're equivalent all the way back at the beginning of the robot, that with F's and B's, and we looked at these strings. So under different conditions, we look at under what cases will the same sensor give the same reading, the same output. And we look at these things called preimages, which is a set of all states that would give the same sensor output. And then we arrange sensors into a kind of lattice by saying one sensor's at least as powerful as another if it has the ability to simulate it, by taking the sensor's output and telling what the other sensor would have outputted. And so we have this whole hierarchy of sensors, and this whole thing is related to the things I've talked about before, but I don't want to go into all the details of that. There's too much here. I think I'm going to run out of time. But generally speaking, we have a very general kind of lattice theory that works for just general sensor models, but also works for any transition system. And you can consider a single sensor as a very trivial kind of transition system that just takes one step. But we have it for any transition system that we can start with, and then we ask, can we make it state relabeled, and then find the minimal one that is sufficient. And as we said, in a very, very general setting, it's unique and minimal. And so I feel like the race is on to find these things. And deep learning is not going to find it directly.